The array had been silent for 200 years, and Naomi Osei was the only person left who still checked it every morning, like it might have something to say. She stood in the cold observation room above the Atacama dishes, coffee going cold in her hand, watching the same green line crawl across the same black screen it had crawled across for as long as she'd worked here. No spike, no pattern, no answer. Just Earth, still talking to a galaxy that had never once talked back. "They're pulling the funding," said a voice behind her. Tomas, her deputy, didn't bother softening it anymore. "Council votes Thursday. They want the land for a solar farm." "They always want the land for something," Naomi said. "This time they'll get it. 200 years, Naomi. 200 years of shouting into an empty room. Even you have to admit." "I don't have to admit anything." She set the coffee down. "We've been broadcasting since before either of our grandparents were born. If we stop now, it's not a scientific decision, it's a surrender." Tomas didn't answer that. Nobody ever did because nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Maybe the galaxy had looked at Earth once, a long time ago, and simply decided it wasn't worth the trouble. 14,000 kilometers away in a bar outside a decommissioned naval base in Norfolk, Ilya Astor was losing a game of cards he didn't care about, to a man he didn't like, in a life he no longer recognized as his own. "You're not even trying," the man across the table said. "I'm trying," Ilya said, which was a lie. The same way most things he said these days were lies, small and easy and designed to end conversations quickly. 8 years ago he'd commanded the Halcyon, the UN Space Corps' finest deep-orbit vessel, on a routine survey mission to the edge of the solar system. He'd come back alone. The official report called it a malfunction. Ilya had stopped believing that report the moment he wrote it, because he was the one who'd been ordered to write it word for word, by people who never explained why. He folded his hand and left before the next round started, the way he left most things now. He didn't know that 1,100 kilometers south, in an underground listening post that most governments had forgotten they were still funding, an array of Chilean dishes had just picked up something that made every alarm in the building scream at once. Naomi was down the stairs before Thomas finished shouting her name. "It's not noise," he said, hands shaking over the console. "Naomi, it's not. Look at the structure. It's layered. There's syntax in it." She shoved him gently aside and looked for herself. The signal filled the screen in tight, deliberate bands, nothing like the chaotic scatter of a pulsar or the flat hum of background radiation. It looked built. It looked like something had sat down and composed it. "Run it through everything we've got," she said. "Every translation model, every pattern matcher, everything." It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes that felt like 4 years. The whole room holding its breath around a signal that had crossed who knew how much of the galaxy to land in a valley in Chile at 2 in the morning. The translation resolved onto the screen in flat clinical text, stripped of all the wonder that should have come with it. Source designation, uncatalogued, tag, Ash Covenant. Message: "We remember what you were. Confirm." Nobody spoke. Thomas read it 3 times like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Confirm what?" he finally said. "Confirm we exist? We've been telling the galaxy we exist for 2 centuries. Naomi didn't answer right away. She was looking at the phrase "we remember" and feeling something cold settle low in her stomach, because that wasn't the language of a first contact. First contact didn't remember you. First contact didn't already have an opinion about who you used to be. "Get me a line to the UN Space Council," she said. "Now. Not tomorrow. Now." It took 11 minutes to get anyone with authority on the line, and in those 11 minutes 3 things happened that nobody in the room would ever be able to explain afterward, no matter how many times investigators asked. Every satellite in Earth orbit went dark at the exact same instant, not offline, not malfunctioning, just gone, as if something had reached out and closed a hand around the entire net of human eyes in the sky. The array's receivers, still locked onto the source of the signal, registered a mass entering the outer solar system that had not been there 9 minutes earlier, and had somehow crossed a distance that should have taken years to cross in less time than it took Naomi to read the confirmation request twice. And in Norfolk, 700 kilometers from where Naomi stood, Ilya Astor woke on his couch at 2:14 a.m. with his heart pounding and the taste of copper in his mouth, gripped by a certainty he hadn't felt in 8 years. The exact same certainty he'd felt in the last 30 seconds before he lost his entire crew. Something is out there, and it's not lost. It's looking for us. He didn't know why he knew that. He never would fully understand it, not even later, not even after everything. But he got up, turned on every screen in his apartment, and watched the news alerts begin to stack on top of each other. Unexplained satellite blackout, unidentified object entering the solar system, no statement yet from the UN Space Council, and felt the old training take over, the part of him that had once commanded a ship, sliding back into place like a bone resetting. By the time the sun rose over Chile, the object had a trajectory locked, and the trajectory was Earth. It wasn't moving fast. That was somehow worse than if it had been. It came in slow and steady and unbothered, the way something moves when it has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Military assets scrambled across 6 continents, emergency broadcasts cut into television and radio in 40 languages within the hour. The UN Space Council convened an emergency session that would run for the next 18 hours straight, and through all of it, the object said nothing. No hail, no greeting, no demand. Just a vast, dark shape sliding closer to Earth every hour, ignoring every attempt at contact as if it hadn't come to talk to the planet at all, as if it had come to look at something and confirm for itself what it found. Naomi stood in the observation room long after Thomas and the others had gone to argue with generals and diplomats on secure lines, staring at the last message still glowing on the screen behind her. "We remember what you were. Confirm." She thought about the word remember. Not heard of, not detected. Remember. The word you used for something you had already known, once, a long time ago, and had chosen, for reasons of its own, to forget. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. "Dr. Osei," the voice on the line said, flat and official, the kind of voice that only ever delivered bad news efficiently. "You're being reassigned, effective immediately, to a first contact task force under direct UN Space Council authority. A transport is already inbound to your facility." "Reassigned to do what?" Naomi said. There was a pause on the line, and when the voice answered, it didn't sound flat anymore. It sounded, for just a second, afraid. "The object has stopped," the voice said. "It's holding position at the edge of lunar orbit, and 10 minutes ago it opened a channel, not to any government, not to any agency. It opened a channel addressed, specifically, by name, to you." The ship didn't look like it was built. It looked like it had survived. Naomi saw it for the first time through the viewport of a military shuttle, 3 hours after the strangest phone call of her life, and the sight of it stole the breath out of her chest. It was vast, kilometers of dark, ridged hull, scarred in long channels that ran like old wounds across its surface, patched in places with material that didn't match the rest, as if it had been repaired 1,000 times by 1,000 different hands over 1,000 different years. It didn't gleam like she'd imagined an alien ship would gleam. It looked tired. It looked like it had been fighting something for a very long time. "That's not a first contact vessel," said the man strapped into the seat across from her. General Marcus Ade had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything decades ago, and even he couldn't keep the edge out of his voice. "That's a warship that got old." Beside him sat a young woman gripping a tablet so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Suri Chen, the council's top xenolinguist, pulled out of a comfortable academic post 12 hours ago and thrown into the strangest week of her career. She hadn't said much since boarding. Naomi understood. There wasn't much to say. Ilya Astor sat closest to the viewport, and he hadn't looked away from the ship once. Nobody had explained to Naomi why a disgraced former UN Space Corps captain with a classified black mark on his record had been added to the team at the last minute, overriding 2 other candidates with better clearance. When she'd asked, The answer had been a shrug and a folder stamped with more redactions than actual text. She watched him now, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked the ship's scars like he was reading a language only he understood, and she filed the question away for later. The shuttle docked through an opening that appeared in the hull without any visible seam, like the ship had simply decided to let them in. The chamber beyond was enormous, lit in a soft amber glow, empty except for a single figure waiting at its center. It stood taller than any of them, its form built along lines that were almost humanoid and almost entirely not. Too many joints in the wrong places, skin the color of weathered stone, eyes that held no pupil at all, just a soft inner light. It wore no visible weapon, no armor, nothing but simple dark robes marked with a symbol Naomi didn't recognize, stitched over the chest. "I am called Vareth," it said, and its voice came out low and careful, shaped around human words like it had practiced them for a very long time. "You came quickly. That is good. It means you still fear the right things." "What things should we fear?" Naomi asked, before General Aid could turn the moment into an interrogation. Vareth's strange eyes settled on her. "Running out of time," it said simply. Suri stepped forward, tablet still gripped tight. "Your message said you remember what we were. We don't understand what that means. As far as we know, this is the first contact humanity has ever had with another intelligent species." Something in Vareth's posture shifted, not quite a flinch, but close. "That is what the Concord wants you to believe," it said. "It is not true. You are not unknown to the galaxy. You are erased from it." The word landed in the chamber like a dropped weight. "Erased how?" Ilya said. It was the first thing he'd spoken since boarding, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Every record of your species, in every archive maintained by the Interstellar Concord, has been deliberately restricted for longer than your civilization has kept written history," Vareth said. "Not lost, not overlooked, restricted. Your transmissions were received, Dr. Osei. Every single one, for 200 years. They were catalogued, filed, and ignored by policy, not by accident." Naomi felt something go cold and tight in her chest. 200 years of broadcasting into the dark, believing no one was listening, when the truth was worse. Someone had been listening the entire time, and had simply decided humanity wasn't worth an answer. "Why?" she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word. "Why would anyone do that?" "That is a longer answer than I am permitted to give you today," Vareth said, and for the first time, something like regret passed over its stone-colored face. "I am not here to explain the whole of it. I am here to ask you a single question, and to see how you answer it. Not with words, with what you choose to do next." "Ask it," General Aid said, arms crossed, clearly out of patience. Vareth looked at each of them in turn, Naomi, Suri, Adi, and finally, longest of all, Ilya, before it spoke. "Are you still what you were?" Nobody answered, because nobody understood the question well enough to answer it honestly, and Vareth seemed to expect exactly that. "We are not here to judge you," it said quietly. "We are here to see if you're still what you were. That is all the Ash Covenant has ever come to any world to do." "The Ash Covenant," Suri repeated, already typing the words into her tablet, cross-referencing them against every database she had access to. "We have nothing on that name. Nothing at all." "You will not," Vareth said. "We made certain of that ourselves a long time ago, for reasons that were necessary then and remain necessary now." Naomi opened her mouth to press further. There were 100 questions crowding behind her teeth, and she meant to ask every one of them. When the ship's amber lighting flickered, once, and a low tone rippled through the chamber floor beneath their feet. Vareth's head turned sharply toward the far wall, where a section of the hull had gone briefly, subtly transparent, revealing a slice of open space, and the pale curve of the moon beyond it. 3 new lights had appeared in that view, sharp, angular, moving with the kind of precision that human engineering had never come close to. "Conquered vessels," Vareth said, and its voice had changed completely. the careful patience gone, replaced by something tight and urgent. 3 of them. Translated in-system faster than they should be able to. Is that bad? Naomi asked, already knowing the answer from the way the alien's shoulders had gone rigid. Vareth didn't answer immediately. It moved toward the transparent section of hull, robes trailing, and stared out at the 3 approaching lights with an expression that no translator was needed to understand. It was fear, naked, unmistakable fear, on the face of a being that had just claimed to represent an ancient civilization the rest of the galaxy avoided. You should not be here when they arrive, Vareth said, turning back to the humans, and for the first time its calm, practiced diplomacy cracked entirely. None of us should. Why? Ilya said again, sharper this time, stepping forward. What happens when they arrive? Vareth looked at him, really looked at him in a way that made the hair on Naomi's arm stand up, like it was seeing something in Ilya none of the rest of them could. They arrive to enforce a law older than your entire species, Vareth said. And if I am still standing here when they do, they will assume I have already broken it. The hail came through every open frequency on Earth at once, drowning out radio, television, and military channels alike, in a voice that was flat, translated, and utterly without warmth. This is Conquered Enforcement Vessel Trellis 9. Humanity is in violation of the Isolation Directive. Contact with the entity designated Ash Covenant will cease immediately. Comply, or corrective action will be taken. In the amber chamber aboard Vareth's ship, the message repeated 3 times before General Aid finally spoke. Corrective action, he said. That's not a warning. That's a threat with better manners. It is exactly what it sounds like, Vareth said. It hadn't moved from the transparent section of hull, still watching the 3 Concord vessels hold position near the moon, sleek and patient, and utterly unlike its own scarred ancient ship. The directive predates your written history. It exists to keep certain worlds isolated from the wider galaxy. You have just violated it, and they will hold you responsible, not me. Then break contact, Aid said. Right now. We apologize, we comply, and this ends before it becomes a war we cannot win. General, Naomi started. I'm not interested in being diplomatic about our own extinction, Doctor, Aid snapped. And for a moment the exhaustion under his hard exterior showed through. Look at that ship out there. Look at ours. We don't have anything that could survive a real fight, and you want to stand here arguing philosophy with an alien who won't even tell us why any of this is happening. He's not entirely wrong, Suri said quietly, still staring at her tablet, where she'd been quietly translating fragments of the Concord's transmission structure. Whatever this directive is, it's old. Really old. The formatting alone predates everything else we've seen from them. Ilya hadn't spoken. He was watching the 3 ships too, but not with fear, with something closer to recognition, a memory trying to surface that he couldn't quite grab hold of. I've seen ships move like that before, he said finally. Every head in the chamber turned toward him. 8 years ago, he said, voice low like each word cost him something. The Halcyon. We weren't supposed to encounter anything. It was a routine deep-orbit survey, and then there was a ship. Not this shape, but it moved exactly like that. Precise, patient, like it already knew every move we were going to make before we made it. My crew called it a sensor ghost. Command called it a malfunction. I called it... He stopped. What did you call it? Naomi asked gently. I didn't have a word for it, Ilya said. I still don't. But I remember thinking right before we lost containment and I lost my crew, that it wasn't watching us like an enemy. It was watching us like a test. Vareth turned from the viewport, and something in its stone-colored face had gone very still. You already know why they're afraid, it said quietly, to Ilya, and no one else. Look at your own scars, Captain. Before Ilya could ask what that meant, the chamber lit red, and the ship shuddered under a hit that threw all of them off balance. They fired on the ship, Aid shouted over the alarm, bracing against a support strut. Not us. Earth. Look. Through the transparent hull, They could see it clearly now. One of the conquered vessels breaking formation, angling toward the planet, weapons fire lancing down through the atmosphere in slow, deliberate strikes. Not at cities, not yet, but at Earth's orbital defense network, the aging satellites and half-modern platforms that were humanity's entire claim to a modern military presence in space. "They're not waiting for us to comply," Naomi said, horror rising in her voice. "They already decided." What happened next would be studied, replayed, and argued over by military analysts on 6 continents for years afterward, and none of them would ever fully explain it. Earth's orbital defense grid was old, outdated, cobbled together from 3 decades of underfunded programs and international compromises that had never been designed to fight anything more advanced than orbital debris. By every rational measure, it should have been swept aside in minutes. It wasn't. The platforms didn't fight with superior technology. They fought with something the Concorde's targeting systems had never been built to predict: improvisation. Human operators, watching their equipment fail against tactics no manual had ever covered, began making decisions no algorithm would have made, rerouting power through burnt-out systems in configurations that shouldn't have worked, coordinating manually across platforms that had never been designed to communicate with each other, sacrificing damaged units to create firing angles that opened unexpected gaps in the conquered vessel's shielding. It wasn't victory. Not really. But it was survival. Minute after impossible minute, in a fight the Concorde ship's own systems had calculated should have ended in 90 seconds. Aboard the enforcement vessel, an officer who would never be named in any human record stared at his tactical display in open disbelief. Watching a species with a fraction of his technology adapt faster than his own predictive systems could compensate. He transmitted a single line back to Concorde Fleet Command, a line that would matter far more than he understood in that moment. "They're improvising. Recommend escalation to Tier 1 protocol." Aboard the Ash Covenant ship, Vareth watched the battle unfold through the transparent hull with an expression none of the humans could read, somewhere between grief and something dangerously close to hope. "They're going to lose that fight eventually," Aide said, watching the readouts. "This bought us minutes, not a war." "It bought you something more important than minutes," Vareth said quietly. Below, the Concorde vessel finally broke off, pulling back into formation with its companions, its shields flickering with damage no one on Earth had thought possible 90 seconds earlier. The 3 ships held position again, motionless, silent, recalculating. The chamber light steadied. The alarm cut off. For a moment, nobody spoke at all. Then Vareth turned, crossed the chamber in 3 long strides, and grabbed Ilya by the arm with a grip far stronger than his human frame suggested it should have. "You already know why they're afraid," Vareth said again, closer now, urgent, its strange eyes fixed on his. "Look at your own scars, Captain, not the ones on your skin. The ones in your file. Whatever they told you happened to the Halcyon, it is not what happened. And what really happened to you and your crew that day is the exact reason this entire fleet is now sitting outside your planet, deciding whether you're worth destroying before you can grow any further." Ilya hadn't spoken the names of his crew out loud in 8 years, and Vareth's grip on his arm felt like it was trying to drag them out of him anyway. "Let go of me," he said quietly, and Vareth did, immediately stepping back with something like an apology in the set of its shoulders. "I don't have time to be gentle about this, Captain," Vareth said. "None of us do. So I will tell you plainly, the Halcyon did not suffer a malfunction. It was observed deliberately by a Concorde scout vessel testing a hypothesis about your species. What happened to your crew was not an accident. It was a controlled scenario, and you were the variable they were measuring." Naomi felt her stomach drop. Beside her, Suri had gone very still, her tablet forgotten in her hands. "Measuring what?" Ilya said. His voice had dropped to something flat and dangerous, a tone Naomi hadn't heard from him before. "How you would behave when there was no good choice left," Vareth said. "Your ship suffered containment failure in a compartment with your engineer trapped inside. You had 30 seconds to seal the compartment and save your ship and the rest of your crew, or attempt to save her and risk losing everyone. Every predictive model the Concorde scout carried said you would seal the compartment. It was the statistically correct choice. It was the choice every species they had tested before you had made in that exact scenario. Ilya's jaw tightened. Naomi remembered distantly a line buried deep in his redacted file. Crew survival rate 100%, method unconfirmed. You didn't seal it, Vareth said quietly. You went in yourself. You saved her, and you saved the ship, in a window of time your own engineers later calculated should not have been physically possible. That is what the Concorde scout recorded. That is the file that reached the Ash Covenant. That is why we came now, after 200 years of silence instead of 100 years from now or 1,000. The room was silent except for the low hum of the ship around them. Why does that matter to anyone? Ilya said. It was one decision, one moment. Because it was not one moment, Vareth said. It was a pattern beginning. And patterns like that, Captain, are the reason a fleet is sitting outside your planet right now, trying to decide whether to let it finish forming. Naomi stepped forward before the silence could stretch any longer. You said we're erased from every galactic record. You said we're not new to the galaxy at all. I think it's time you told us what that actually means. Vareth looked at her for a long moment, then at Suri, who had quietly reopened her tablet and begun cross-referencing something in the data the Ash Covenant ship had shared with them upon arrival. Fragments of old records, deliberately incomplete that the ship systems had allowed them to access as a gesture of good faith. Show her, Vareth said. Suri turned her tablet around. On the screen was an image she'd pulled from the fragment archive, a symbol, angular and layered, carved into the hull of Vareth's ship in 100 places. Beside it, she'd placed 3 more images. A mark from a Sumerian tablet, a pattern from an Aboriginal rock painting older than written language, a design etched into stone at the edge of an Andean ruin no one had ever fully explained. They were the same symbol, worn differently by time, reshaped by different hands across thousands of years and thousands of miles of an isolated world, but unmistakably, structurally, the same mark. I found this an hour ago, Suri said, and her voice had gone thin with the weight of it. I thought it was a coincidence. It's not, is it? No, Vareth said. It is a mark your own ancestors used to identify something they knew and later forgot. This is not the first time your species has stood where you are standing now, Suri-chin. It is the last time you will be allowed to, if you fail what comes next. Naomi's mind was already racing ahead of the words, trying to fit 200 years of silent broadcasting, and a mark buried in 3 unconnected ancient civilizations into a single terrible shape. You're saying we made contact before, a long time ago, and it went badly enough that we buried the memory of it so deep we forgot it happened at all. I am saying, Vareth said carefully, that this is not the first time we have made first contact. It is the last time we are allowed to. The words hung in the chamber, and for a moment nobody moved because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound small next to them. It was General Aide who broke the silence, and not with words. With the sharp, decisive motion of a man who had heard enough alien philosophy for one day and had already made up his mind about what to do with it. Soldiers, move in, he said into his calm, voice hard. Secure the alien. We're taking it into custody for interrogation. I want answers we can verify, not riddles. General, no. Naomi started, but it was too late. The chamber doors at the far end slid open, and 4 armed soldiers stepped through in tight formation, weapons raised, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of extraction and nothing else. Aide, this is exactly the kind of decision that got Earth's satellites erased by that ship in the first place, Ilya said, stepping between the soldiers and Vareth without fully deciding to do it. You force this. You might start the war. Vareth's people are trying to warn us away from. I'm not willing to bet the entire species on the word of something that won't even tell us its full history, Aide said. Stand down, Captain. That's not a request. Vareth didn't move, didn't run, didn't resist, didn't so much as raise its hands as the soldiers closed the distance. It simply stood there, calm in a way that unsettled Naomi more than panic would have, and looked past the approaching weapons, straight at her. Ask him what happens to civilizations that fail this stage. Vareth said, voice steady even as a soldier's hand closed around its arm. He already knows. He watched it happen to someone else. It is the reason he is standing in this room today instead of some other captain the Conquered considers less dangerous. The soldiers began to pull Vareth toward the chamber doors. Naomi's heart was pounding, her mind racing through everything Vareth had said, trying to find the thread that connected the halcyon, the buried symbol, the erased records, and the word stage, as if this were a process with steps, and Earth had just been placed somewhere on it that none of them yet understood. "Wait," she said, loud enough to stop the room. "Ilya, what is he talking about? What did you watch happen to someone else?" Ilya didn't answer right away. He was staring at Vareth, at the calm, resigned way it let itself be led toward the door, and something in his expression had gone pale and distant, like a door in his memory he'd kept shut for 8 years had just been kicked open. "There was something else out there that day," he said quietly. "Before the halcyon, before my crew. I saw it for less than a second. On a long-range sensor sweep nobody else on my ship registered. It looked like a fleet. It looked like a fleet that had already been destroyed." Naomi put herself between the soldiers and the door before she'd fully decided to do it, and afterward she would never be entirely sure what made her do it. Instinct, or something closer to certainty that this was a mistake Earth would not get to take back. "Stop," she said. "General, stop this. Right now." "Doctor, step aside," Aide said, but there was less command in his voice than there had been a moment ago, a small crack of doubt he wasn't used to hearing in himself. "You heard what Ilya just said," Naomi said. "A destroyed fleet. 8 years ago at the edge of our own solar system, and nobody thought to mention it in any report because nobody believed him. Or because somebody made sure nobody would. If you drag this being off this ship and interrogate it with force, you are not protecting Earth. You are confirming every fear the Concord already has about us." Aide's jaw worked. The soldiers held their position, weapons still raised, waiting on his word. "Then tell me what fear that is," Aide said. "Because nobody in this room has actually said it plainly yet." Vareth, still held loosely by the nearest soldier, who had not yet moved to actually restrain it, looked at Naomi with something that might have been gratitude, and finally answered the question that had been circling the room since the moment they'd stepped aboard. "There is a pattern the Concord has documented across 100,000 years of recorded galactic history," Vareth said. "It is rare. It has only occurred 4 times that any surviving record acknowledges. A young species, pushed to the edge of true extinction, war, catastrophe, collapse, does not always break the way most species break. Sometimes instead of falling apart, it does the opposite. It becomes something else, faster to adapt than any model can predict, more cooperative under pressure than logic accounts for, and fiercely, irrationally devoted to protecting each other, and even strangers at direct cost to itself. That doesn't sound like a threat," Suri said quietly. "It sounds like the best version of us." "It is the best version of you," Vareth agreed. "That is exactly why it terrifies them. The Concord calls it volatility. They have a cleaner name for it in their own archives, but the closest translation in your language is kindled." The soldier holding Vareth's arm finally let go, uncertain now, glancing at Aide for direction he wasn't giving. 3 other species reached this stage before yours," Vareth continued. 3 across 100,000 years out of every civilization the Conquered has ever observed. The isolation directive exists because of what happened to all 3. It quarantines young species long before they can reach this threshold, monitors them from a careful distance, and if a species kindles anyway, despite every precaution, the Concord's policy is not to wait and see what it becomes. "What does it do instead?" Ilya said, though something in his face said he already knew, had already known since he saw a destroyed fleet flicker across a sensor screen 8 years ago and been told he'd imagined it. "It ends them," Vareth said. "Quickly, quietly, before they mature into something the Concord cannot contain. That is what you saw at the edge of your solar system, Captain. That is what remains of the 3rd species to kindle before yours. And that is what the fleet outside your planet right now has been authorized to do to Earth. The chamber went very still. And the Ash Covenant, Naomi said slowly, putting the pieces together as she spoke them. You're not the Concord's enforcers. We are what was left of the first, Vareth said. And for the first time since they'd met its careful diplomatic composure fully broke, revealing something raw and old underneath. Grief that had clearly been carried for a very, very long time. We were the first species to kindle, 10,000 years before your written history began. We were nearly ended the same way the third species was ended. A small number of us survived, scattered, and eventually reformed as something new. Not a government, not an empire, just witnesses, watchers. We made a vow, all of us who survived, that if it ever happened again, we would not simply let it happen unopposed a second time. We came to see if you had kindled, and now that we know you have, we intend to stand between you and what the conquered fleet has been ordered to do. Which is what exactly? Aid said, voice quieter now than it had been in the entire conversation. Before Vareth could answer, the ship's alert tone sounded again, softer this time, almost mournful, and a translated transmission scrolled across the display Suri still held in her hands. She read it once silently, her face going pale, and then read it aloud, her voice cracking halfway through. Confirmed volatility markers present, she said. Authorization granted for Tier 1 correction. Earth's population is not to be considered a survival priority. Nobody spoke. Outside the transparent section of hull, the 3 Concord vessels had shifted formation, spreading apart, angling toward positions around the planet with the calm, patient precision of something that had done this before and expected no surprises this time. Tier 1 correction, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. What does that mean? Vareth, what does that mean? Vareth turned from the transmission to look at all of them, Naomi, Suri, Ade, and Ilya, standing together in a chamber built by a species that had survived this exact moment once before and had spent 10,000 years since preparing for the chance to stand in this room again. It means they have stopped debating whether you're a threat, Vareth said quietly. It means they've decided you already are one, and it means that everything that made you unique enough to draw our attention in the first place, every choice like the one Ilya made 8 years ago, every improvisation your defense grid made an hour ago that should not have been possible, is no longer a curiosity to them. It is evidence, and they intend to erase the evidence completely before it finishes becoming what we became a very long time ago, on a world none of you have ever heard of, that no longer exists. Ade was the first to move, snapping into the version of himself that had built a career out of impossible decisions made under worse odds than this. How long do we have? Hours, Vareth said, not days. Then tell us how to stop it, Naomi said. You said you didn't come to save us by force, so tell us what you did come to do. Vareth looked at each of them once more, and this time, when it spoke, its voice had steadied into something that sounded, for the first time since they'd met it, almost like hope. I came to give you one chance to show them something our own historical record has never once shown the conquered from a kindled species reaching this stage, it said. Not power, not defiance, something rarer than either, that even we did not manage in time, 10,000 years ago, and you have hours to prove it exists in you, in front of every ship and every eye now watching this planet, or Earth ends exactly the way the last 3 worlds like it ended before you. 3 hours was not enough time to save a planet, and every person in that chamber knew it, and none of them said it out loud because there was no time left for the luxury of saying the obvious. Talk fast, Ade said to Vareth. What is the thing you need us to prove? I cannot tell you, Vareth said. If I tell you and you perform it, the Concord will see it as theater, staged for their benefit, and it will mean nothing. It has to be real. It has to be something you choose, not something you are told to choose. That's not an answer, Ade snapped. It is the only honest one I have, Vareth said. Naomi watched Ade's face cycle through frustration, disbelief, and finally something she hadn't expected from him. Resolve, hard and sudden, like a man who had spent his whole career preparing for a moment exactly like this one without knowing it. Then we stop trying to guess what they want to see, Aide said. And we do what we would have done anyway. He turned to the comm officer trailing him and began issuing orders that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. A full, unified command structure across every nation's remaining orbital and atmospheric defense assets, something the fractured governments of Earth had never once managed to build in 200 years of trying. He didn't ask permission. He simply built it, calling in favors and burning others, patching together a single defense grid out of 100 competing militaries in under an hour, because there was no time left to do it the slow way, the political way, the way it had always failed before. Naomi and Suri worked beside him, translating conquered fleet movements in real time with Varith's help, watching the 3 enforcement vessels begin their final approach. Ilya barely spoke through any of it. He sat at a secondary console, running old flight patterns from a mission 8 years buried, watching the conquered ships move and finding, again and again, the same precise, patient rhythm he remembered from the Halcyon. He wasn't planning a counterattack. He was looking for something else, a weakness, a gap, a moment where the pattern would break. He found it 40 minutes before the fleet reached firing range. "They've got a damaged support vessel," he said, pulling the readout up for the others. 4th ship trailing the formation. Not an enforcer, smaller, older, probably a logistics or repair craft. It took shrapnel damage during the skirmish earlier, and it's been quietly falling out of formation ever since. Nobody's covering it. It's going to lose containment in the next hour. "So?" Aide said. "That's their ship, their problem." "It's got a crew," Ilya said. "I recognize the transponder pattern from the officer who called for Tier 1 protocol during the first skirmish. That's his ship." The room went quiet. "You're not suggesting we help him," Aide said slowly. "I'm suggesting," Ilya said, "that Varith told us the thing they've never seen from a species like us at this stage isn't strength. It's this. Right here. An enemy dying in front of us, and choosing to save him anyway, when nobody would ever know if we didn't." "That's insane," Ade said. "That's a distraction while their fleet finishes moving into position." "Maybe," Ilya said. "Or maybe it's the only thing left that they haven't already seen us do 100 times before in 100 simulations, and predicted." Naomi looked at Varith, searching its face for confirmation, for permission, for anything. Varith gave her nothing, no nod, no words, just the same steady, watchful patience it had carried since the moment they'd met, because this was never a decision it was allowed to make for them. "Do it," Naomi said. "Ilya, take a crew, go now." Aide didn't stop him. That, in its own way, was its own quiet answer. Ilya led the rescue himself, piloting a battered atmospheric shuttle alongside 2 volunteer crews who didn't fully understand why they were risking their lives for an enemy vessel, and went anyway, because Ilya asked, and because something about the request felt like the only sane thing left to do in an insane day. They reached the failing conquered support ship with minutes to spare before its containment gave out entirely, cutting through damaged hull plating to pull 4 crew members free, including the officer whose voice Ilya recognized instantly from the recording of the first skirmish, the one who had recommended escalation, who had, in effect, helped author the order that might end Earth within the hour. The officer stared at Ilya through his helmet visor, disoriented, uncomprehending, as human hands hauled him out of a dying ship instead of leaving him to it. "Why?" the officer said, voice raw over the comm translator. "Why would you do this?" Ilya didn't have a clean answer, and he didn't try to invent one. "Because you were dying," he said, "and we could stop it. That was the whole reason. It was broadcast entirely by accident. An open comm channel nobody had thought to close during the chaos, carrying the entire rescue live across every frequency the Concorde fleet was monitoring, and half the frequencies humanity was too." Aboard the Ash Covenant ship, Varith watched the footage with something that, for the first time since the humans had met it, looked entirely unguarded. "That is what we needed them to see," it said quietly, more to itself than to Naomi standing beside it. "Not because we asked for it, because none of you knew we were still watching when you chose it." Then Varith did something it had not done once since arriving in the system. It opened a direct channel to the Concord fleet and invoked a rite so old that Suri's translation software returned 3 separate archaic terms before settling on the closest modern equivalent: sponsorship. An ancient, rarely used clause allowing a recognized elder civilization to vouch for a kindled species' probationary survival. Unused for 10,000 years, attached now to a single piece of unedited footage of an enemy soldier being pulled alive from a dying ship by the hands of the very species the Concord had just voted to erase. The response took 40 minutes to arrive. It felt like 40 years. When it came, it was not a celebration. It was not gratitude. It was a single, clipped line from the Concord fleet commander, cold and formal and utterly without warmth, and it was, in its own way, the most human moment anyone in that chamber had witnessed all day, because it was, unmistakably, the sound of someone hesitating. Tier 1 correction suspended. Fleet withdrawing pending further observation. The 3 ships turned away from Earth an hour later, sliding back into the dark the same way they'd arrived, offering no explanation, no apology, no promise of what came next. Earth had not been welcomed. It had been spared, provisionally, watched, still uncertain of its place in a galaxy that had spent 200 years pretending it didn't exist. Naomi rebuilt the broadcast array in the weeks that followed, not out of habit this time, but out of something closer to purpose. She didn't write a plea this time. With Varith's help, and the ancient symbol Suri had traced through 3 unconnected human civilizations, she crafted something else entirely. A signal marked not as a request, but as a declaration, sent out into the dark under a designation the galaxy would now have to reckon with whether it wanted to or not. We are still here. We remember now. And we are not done becoming who we are. On the observation deck of the Ash Covenant ship, in the quiet hour before it prepared to leave the system, Ilya stood beside Varith and watched Earth turn slowly beneath them. Blue and impossibly fragile, and for the first time in 200 years, genuinely seen. "Do you regret it?" Ilya asked quietly. "What happened to the others? The ones before us who didn't make it?" Varith didn't answer with words. It simply reached out and placed one long, weathered hand against the cold viewport glass, over the curve of the planet turning below, and held it there in silence for a long moment. A gesture that needed no translation at all, and that Ilya understood without being told, he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Below them, Earth kept turning, unaware and aware all at once, forever changed, and for the first time in longer than anyone alive could remember, no longer alone in the dark.